Hey, I'm Nathan, and before we start I want you to think about something that sounds boring until it isn't. Every single thing that happens to a sick child in this country generates paperwork. A visit, a vital sign, a minute of nursing care, a signature. And wherever paperwork turns into money, somebody eventually figures out how to make the paperwork first and the sickness second. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's just arithmetic, and arithmetic doesn't care whose kid it is. The story I'm telling you today is about a man who baked bread for a living. He wasn't a detective. He wasn't a soldier. He got up at midnight, went to a brick building on a dark street, and made 400 loaves before the sun came up. And he did it so reliably that you could set your watch by him. And that, it turns out, was the whole problem. Because when people plan something terrible around your life, they don't plan around your strength. They plan around your schedule. You're going to learn how a system that was built to prove nurses actually show up ended up being the thing that proved they never should have. You're going to learn why an 11-year-old boy taped a camera to his own chest with the tape he stole from his own medicine cabinet. And you're going to find out what a father does when a police officer holds up a photograph and says, "Sir, you sure you want to see this?" Stay with me. This one gets ugly before it gets right. The bakery on Delacroix Street had a smell that got into your clothes and never really left, and Lincoln Ostrander had stopped noticing it around the time he turned 23. Everybody else noticed. Cashiers noticed. His kids' teachers noticed. A woman at a wedding once told him he smelled like a Sunday morning, and he'd laughed and said, "No ma'am, I smell like a Tuesday at 1 in the morning," which is a different thing entirely. He was 39 years old, and he had run Ostrander Bread Company since he was 26, which is when his father Rudy dropped a sheet pan in the proofroom, sat down on an overturned bucket, and died of a heart attack so fast that the timer for the first bake was still running when the ambulance arrived. Rudy had opened the place in 1978 with a used deck oven and a loan from a credit union that no longer existed. He used to say there were two kinds of businesses in this world, the kind where you can be late and the kind where you can't. Bread was the second kind. Yeast doesn't negotiate. Yeast doesn't care that you're tired, or that your marriage is bad, or that your son is sick. It rises on its own clock, and if you're not there when it's ready, you throw the whole batch away. So Lincoln was there. Every night, midnight to 8, 6 days a week, for 13 years. His alarm went off at 11:40. He was out the door by 11:55. He parked in the same spot behind the building at 12:04, and he unlocked the back door, and he flipped the 4 breaker switches in the same order. Ovens, mixers, lights, cooler. Because his father had done it that way, and because doing it that way meant he never had to think about it. In a town like Wexbridge, Pennsylvania, a town of 11,000 people wedged into a valley in Tilghman County, a man like that becomes a landmark. People driving home from second shift at the plastics plant saw the bakery windows go gold at 10 after midnight and knew where they were. Everybody in Wexbridge knew where Lincoln Ostrander was at 2 in the morning. That's the part you need to hold on to. He had 2 kids. Hank was 11, a 6th grader at Pine Haven Middle School, a kid with his mother's dark eyes and his grandfather's hands, big square hands that were already too big for his wrists. Hank drew. That was the thing about him. He drew constantly, on receipts, on the backs of order sheets, on the paper bags. He drew machines mostly, cutaway drawings of things, an oven sliced open, a car sliced open, a house sliced open, with all the rooms showing and little arrows explaining what happened in each one. He was not a loud kid. He watched things. Lincoln used to joke that Hank was the only person in the family who never lost an argument, because he never started one. He just waited about 4 days and then said one sentence that ended it. Roxy was 5, and Roxy was the opposite. Roxy was noise with shoes on. And then there was Aubrey. Aubrey Kirkwood had walked into the bakery on a Saturday in October 12 years earlier, when she was 24, to pick up 3 dozen dinner rolls for her mother's church thing, and she had complained, actually complained, at the counter, in front of 2 customers, that the rolls in the case looked uneven. Lincoln had told her that was because a person made them. She'd stared at him for a second, and then laughed so hard she had to put a hand on the glass. He married her 14 months later. She was smart, she was funny in a mean way that he found thrilling at 27 and exhausting at 36, and she had grown up in a family that had spent 40 years almost getting somewhere. The Kirkwoods were always 6 months from a big year. Marjorie Kirkwood, Aubrey's mother, had run an adult daycare center out of a converted ranch house on Route 9 for a decade, until the state pulled her license over documentation problems, which Marjorie described, forever after, as a paperwork misunderstanding. Aubrey's older brother Sutton had a CDL, 2 DUIs, and a permanently aggrieved expression, and he had been fired from every job he'd ever held by people he described as jealous. Aubrey had gotten out. That was how she said it. I got out. She'd done 2 years of nursing school and quit, done medical billing for a podiatrist, done front desk at an urgent care, and she was very good at all of it and bored by all of it. What she wanted, and she said this out loud more than once, was to matter, to walk into a room and have people be glad she was there. The bakery did not do that for her. Being married to a man who left the house at midnight did not do that for her. Looking back, and Lincoln looked back a lot, later, in the ugly months, he could point to the exact week it started going wrong, and it wasn't a fight. It was a Tuesday in March, 8 months before the fainting, when Hank passed out at a bowling alley birthday party. Just went down. 1 second he was standing at the ball return. The next he was on the floor with his eyes rolled back, out for maybe 15 seconds. Every adult in the building lost 20 years off their life. They took him to Wexbridge Regional, and the ER doctor did an EKG and a basic panel, and said what ER doctors say, which is that kids faint, it's usually nothing, follow up with your pediatrician. And it probably was nothing. That's the thing Lincoln came back to, over and over. The first one was probably nothing. A hot room, a growth spurt, a kid who hadn't eaten since 10 in the morning. But Aubrey came home from that ER visit lit up like a switchboard. She had met somebody in the waiting room, a man named Damien Ashcombe, who had been there with another family, and who had knelt down next to her while she cried and told her, gently, that she was not crazy, that a lot of parents get told it's nothing for years before somebody finally listens. Damien Ashcombe was a registered nurse. He was 44, he had a jaw like a magazine ad, and a voice that dropped half an octave when he wanted you to feel something, and he was the founder and chief executive of a company called Little Lantern Pediatric Home Care. Their logo was a small brass lantern with a warm light in it. It was on their vans, their polos, their tote bags, their banners at the county fair. Their tagline was 3 words long, and it was printed under the lantern on everything they owned. We stay awake. Lincoln met him 9 days later, in his own kitchen, at 4 in the afternoon, and shook his hand and thought, this is a guy who has never in his life been the second most confident person in a room. Ashcombe had brought a folder. He'd brought a folder to a first meeting. Inside was a 1-page thing about pediatric syncope and something called autonomic dysregulation, and a 2nd page listing the services Little Lantern provided, and a 3rd page, this was the one Lincoln remembered, a photograph of a sleeping child with a nurse sitting in a chair beside the bed, reading a paperback under a small lamp. Most of what we do isn't medical, Ashcombe said. Most of what we do is being awake so you can sleep. Aubrey was crying, not hard. The good kind of crying, the relieved kind. And Lincoln, who was tired, who had been up since 11:40 the night before, who had a wife who had not looked at him with that much light in her face in 3 years, said the sentence that he would take apart in his head 10,000 times afterward. He said, okay, if it helps her, okay. 2 months after that, Hank had a 2nd episode, at home this time, in the middle of the night, and Aubrey was the one who found him. 2 weeks after that, a 3rd. By August there had been 6, and Hank Ostrander had a diagnosis, a specialist, a binder with tabs in it, and something called a plan of care that authorized 16 hours a day of private duty skilled nursing in the family home. 16 hours a day. The paperwork moved faster than the illness did. That was the first thing that ever really bothered Lincoln, and he couldn't explain why it bothered him, so he didn't say it out loud. Every time Hank had an episode, the response was already built. The forms were already the right forms. Somebody was already on the phone with the managed care plan before the ER discharge printed. It was like watching a fire department that arrived 30 seconds before the fire. By September, there were strangers in his house at night. That is a thing nobody tells you about. Lincoln would come home at 8 in the morning smelling like a Tuesday at 1, and there'd be a woman in navy scrubs at his kitchen table filling out a flow sheet, and she'd look up and say, "Good morning, Mr. Ostrander," in the voice you use with a visitor. In his house, there was a folding chair in the corner of Hank's room now, and a small clip-on lamp, and a pulse oximeter with a red glow, and a laminated schedule on the refrigerator with 3 names on it in rotation: Berenice, Hester, Whitley. The house smelled different. That's a stupid thing to notice, but he noticed it. It smelled like hand sanitizer and somebody else's shampoo, and Hank changed. Not dramatically. That was the cruelty of it. If it had been dramatic, somebody would have stopped it. Hank got quieter, which was hard to see in a quiet kid. He slept 14 hours on weekends. He got clumsy, knocked over a glass, missed a step, put his hand out for a door frame that was 2 inches to the left. He stopped drawing. That one, Lincoln noticed. In October, he cleaned out the recycling bin behind the counter at the bakery and realized there hadn't been a single drawing on a receipt roll in 6 weeks. He asked Hank about it on a Sunday, the 2 of them in the truck coming back from the hardware store. Hank said, "I get tired in my hands." Lincoln said, "In your hands?" And Hank looked out the window at the wet road and said, "It's like when your foot's asleep, but it's your whole arms. It happens on the nights." The nights? When Berenice is on. Lincoln kept both hands on the wheel and drove another 1/4 mile before he said anything, because his voice had gone somewhere he didn't want his son to hear. "Buddy," he said, "what happens on the nights?" And Hank Ostrander, 11 years old, said the sentence that ended everything. In the flat way, he said everything. "Somebody comes in my room, and Mom holds the door so it doesn't squeak." If you want to know the exact moment a man's life divides into a before and an after, it isn't always the loud one. Sometimes it's a kid in a wet truck saying 9 words about a door hinge. What Lincoln Ostrander did next was reasonable, and it was almost the worst decision of his life. He bought a camera. $41 at the electronics place in the strip mall by the highway, a little white cube that ran off a wall plug and pushed video to an app on his phone. He put it on the bookshelf in Hank's room facing the bed, tucked behind a plastic dinosaur, and he did not tell his wife. And for 4 nights he sat in the office at the bakery, between the 2nd and 3rd bake with his phone propped against the flour scale, watching a grainy green rectangle of his son sleeping. Nothing happened for 4 nights. On the 5th night, the camera went offline at 1:12 a.m. and never came back. When he got home at 8 in the morning, Aubrey was standing in the kitchen with the little white cube on the counter in front of her, and she was not yelling. Lincoln had expected yelling. He would have preferred yelling. She said, "Berenice found this." "Okay, do you understand what this looks like? A camera in a child's bedroom that the mother didn't know about, that the nursing staff didn't know about? He's my son. There is a woman in this house all night, Lincoln. A woman who is undressing him for bed and helping him in the bathroom, and you put a camera in there. Without telling anybody. And that, right there, in his own kitchen, with the coffee maker gurgling, was the first time Lincoln Ostrander understood that he was not in an argument. He was in a structure. Something had been built around him while he was at work, and he had just walked into a wall of it in the dark. 11 days later, he was served with a petition for temporary primary custody, and attached to it was a children and youth report, filed anonymously, that described a home where a medically fragile child was left in the care of rotating strangers because the father worked overnight shifts and was, quote, unavailable and uninvolved during all critical care hours. Also attached was a photograph of a small white camera on a bookshelf, tucked behind a plastic dinosaur. Rhea Underhill had an office above a dry cleaner in the county seat and a habit of letting people finish their whole story before she said a word. Lincoln talked for 35 minutes. When he was done, she took off her glasses, put them on the desk, and told him the truth in the smallest number of words she could manage. "Right now," she said, "you are a man who works nights and puts hidden cameras in his son's bedroom, and she is a full-time caregiver to a sick child with a signed plan of care from a licensed physician. If we go to court next Thursday and you say what you just said to me, you will lose. Not because it isn't true, because it isn't provable, and because the provable things all point the other way. So what do I do? You be boring," she said. "You go to work. You show up to every visitation 4 minutes early. You don't record anybody. And you get me something that is not your opinion." He asked her how long that would take. She said, "Longer than you want." So Lincoln Ostrander went to work. He got up at 11:40. He was out the door at 11:55. He parked in the same spot at 12:04 and flipped the 4 breakers in the same order. He made 400 loaves, and he did not put a camera anywhere. And every second Wednesday and every other weekend, he picked up his kids in a driveway he used to own the mortgage on, and he was 4 minutes early every single time. And he started a notebook. It was a composition book from the school supply aisle, 99 cents, and it lived under the register drawer at the bakery with a permanent dust of flour in the gutter of the pages. He didn't write feelings in it. He wrote facts, because he had figured out that facts were the only currency anybody in this new world would accept. August 14th, H, tired, both arms, says starts around 9 p.m. Scepter 2, H slept 15 hours. Roxy says H didn't get up for cartoons. Septon 19, nurse van in driveway, 11:40 p.m., left 7:50 a.m. Octor 6, Aubrey asked about dad's estate paperwork. The building. Oct 11, H said, I woke up and my arm was cold. That last one sat in him like a swallowed stone for 3 days before he understood why. You know what makes your arm cold at 3 in the morning? Alcohol on skin, and alcohol wipe evaporating. Meanwhile, the story of Little Lantern Pediatric Home Care was the best story in Tilghman County. Damian Ashcombe had built it from a 2-room office over a bank branch into a company with 110 employees in 4 counties in 6 years. He had a way of describing what he did that made people at Rotary lunches put their forks down. He'd say, there are children in this county whose parents haven't slept a full night since the child was born. Not tired, not new parent tired. 6 years without 8 consecutive hours, because if they sleep and the alarm doesn't wake them, their child dies. We are the reason those parents sleep. We stay awake. It was a good line because it was true. That was what made him dangerous. Most of what Little Lantern did was real, and good, and desperately needed, and the nurses who worked there mostly loved the kids they sat up with. Ashcombe knew exactly what he had, a beautiful, immaculate, load-bearing wall of genuine good work, and behind it, in about 11 cases out of 140, something else. He had not started out planning it. He had started out as a case manager for a managed care plan, which is a job where you spend all day approving and denying things, and where you learn the shape of the machine from the inside. And what he learned was simple enough to fit on an index card. Nobody pays for a child who might be sick. They pay for a child who has documented, witnessed, recurring events. A diagnosis is a door. Events are the key. And events, unlike almost everything else in medicine, are witnessed by a nurse, at night, in a house, with no camera and no second observer, and recorded in the nurse's own handwriting on a flow sheet. 16 hours a day of pediatric private duty nursing billed at $62 an hour is $362,000 a year per child. Add the family stipend for a parent trained as a paid caregiver, which in Pennsylvania a mother could collect while the agency collected too. Add the eligibility that a complex care designation unlocks. Add, if the family had anything, and some of them did, a settlement, a grandparent's estate, a building on Delacroix Street, the fact that a custodial parent of a disabled child controls things that a custodial parent of a healthy one does not. Ashcombe's word for the children who could hold that structure up was on a spreadsheet in his own laptop, in a tab he had built himself and never shared with anyone above the level of clinical director. The tab was called Lantern, and Aubrey Kirkwood, who wanted to matter, who wanted to walk into a room and have people be glad she was there, had been sleeping with him since the 3rd week of May. It wasn't even hidden well. That's what got Lincoln, later. There had never been anything clever about it. There was a lanyard in the console of her car, with a little lantern badge clipped to it that said Volunteer, Family Ambassador. There was a photograph in the county paper of the two of them at the Lantern Gala, her hand on his forearm, both laughing at something outside the frame. There was a receipt in a coat pocket from a hotel in Harrisburg on a night she'd told him she was at a caregiver training in Scranton. He had found that receipt in April. He'd sat on the edge of the bathtub with it for a long time, and then he had put it back in the coat pocket and said nothing, because he had 2 kids and a business and a marriage he was still, stupidly, trying to keep, and because a man who confronts his wife with a receipt has spent his only card for the price of 1 bad night. He did not know then that the affair and the illness were the same thing. Nobody would have guessed that. Why would you? November 3rd was a Tuesday. It was 41 degrees and raining sideways, the kind of Pennsylvania November rain that comes at you horizontally and finds the gap in your collar. Lincoln finished the morning bake, went home, slept from 9 to 2:30, and was in the back of the shop at 3:40 in the afternoon, breaking down the mixer, when his phone rang and the screen said, Pine Haven Middle School. Except it hadn't been 3:40. It had been 11:06 in the morning, and he'd slept through 4 calls, and by the time he woke up there were 9. Here is what happened at Pine Haven Middle School, while Lincoln Ostrander was asleep. Second period, health class, room 114. Hank Ostrander stood up to hand a worksheet forward, said, "Wait," in a perfectly normal voice, and folded. Not a stagger, a fold, straight down, the way a marionette drops when you let go of the strings. He hit the corner of a desk with his cheekbone on the way, and he was unconscious before he reached the floor. The teacher, a first-year named Miss Whitmarsh, did the exact right thing and screamed for the office. The nurse, Prudence Yarnell, was there in 90 seconds, which is fast for a building that size, and she got down on the linoleum with a class of 26 sixth graders backed against the whiteboard. Prue Yarnell had been a school nurse for 26 years and an ER nurse for 9 before that. She checked his airway. She checked his pulse, which was slow, 48 and thready in a kid who should have been at 90. She said his name and got nothing. And then she did what you do, which is you get to the chest, because you need to see it rise, and you need bare skin under your stethoscope, so she took hold of the front of Hank Ostrander's shirt and she opened it. And Prudence Yarnell, who had been in a room with a shotgun wound and had once delivered a baby on the floor of a Walmart, screamed loud enough that they heard it in the front office 2 hallways away. Taped to the boy's sternum, under his shirt, wrapped around and around his ribs with the beige elastic tape people use for sprained ankles, was a black plastic rectangle the size of a deck of cards with a lens on the front and a small red light blinking on the side, and a wire running from the bottom of it down under his waistband to a battery pack. Under the tape, on the inside of both elbows and along the outside of his left thigh, were needle marks. Not 1, not 2, a field of them, in various stages of healing, some yellow-green and old, 2 of them fresh enough to still have a pinpoint of dried blood in the center. And on the back of the black plastic rectangle, in blue Sharpie, in the handwriting of an 11-year-old boy, it said, "If I am asleep, open this." Principal Neil Wickersham arrived 30 seconds later, took one look at a wired device taped to a child's chest in a public school building, and did what any principal in America in this decade does. He put his arms out across the hallway and started moving children the other way, and he said the sentence that everybody in that hallway would repeat for the next 2 years. Nobody touches it. Police first. Call 911 now. They evacuated the East Wing. They kept Hank where he was, because you don't move an unconscious child, and Prue Yarnell would not leave him, and she sat on that floor with her hand on his forehead for 11 minutes with an evacuation going on around her, saying his name. The first officer through the door was Dominic Saylor, who was 29 and had been on the Wexbridge force for 4 years, and who took about 6 seconds to determine that the thing on the boy's chest was a $40 sport camera from a big box store and not anything that was going to hurt anybody. The second thing he determined took longer, and he did it kneeling on that floor with gloves on and his body camera running, and when he was done, he stood up, walked out into the hallway, and called his sergeant and then, without waiting for permission, the county detective unit. Because the boy was covered in injection sites, and the camera on his chest had a memory card in it, and the memory card was full. Lincoln got there at 11:51, having run 4 red lights, having left the truck at an angle across 2 spaces in the bus loop. There was an ambulance, and 3 cruisers, and the East Wing doors were propped, and there were kids in a line out on the wet grass under the overhang, with coats over their heads. And there was a young officer with rain on his shoulders, standing between him and the door. "Mr. Ostrander, that's my son. That's my son in there. He's alive. He's breathing. He's got a pulse. The medics are with him right now, and they're taking him to Corriveau." "He's alive," Lincoln said, "Okay," and then said it 3 more times, and then something in the officer's face made him stop. Saylor had a phone in his hand, screen down. "Sir," he said, "before you go in there, we recovered a device. Your son was wearing a camera." We've got the card, and I've looked at enough of it to know we're calling detectives. A camera. He taped it to himself, sir. He wrote on the back of it. And Lincoln, who was standing in the rain outside a middle school, said, "Wrote what?" Sailor told him. Then he said, "Sir, what we found is disturbing. It's not something I can unshow you. You're going to see it eventually, but you do not have to see it right now, and I'd honestly rather you saw it sitting down with a detective." Lincoln Ostrander looked at that young man for a long moment, rain running off the gutter behind him. Somewhere inside the building, a radio was talking. He said, "He's my son. I need to know." Sailor turned the phone around. It was a still frame, pulled off the card, grainy, lit by the small amount of light that gets into a bedroom from a hallway. It was shot from low and at an angle, from a boy's chest, lying on his back, looking up and slightly to the side. It was Hank's room. Lincoln knew every inch of it. He'd painted that ceiling. The corner of the poster was in frame, the one with the cutaway of a jet engine that Hank had asked for 2 Christmases ago. The timestamp burned into the corner said 2:41:07 a.m. There was a woman standing over the bed in navy scrubs. Her left hand was on the boy's forearm, thumb pressed down to raise a vein, the way you do. In her right hand, held up near her shoulder in the light, was a syringe with the cap off. And behind her, in the doorway, holding the door still with one hand so the hinge wouldn't squeak, and holding a phone up in the other hand with the screen glowing white as she took a picture of the bed, was Aubrey. She was not screaming. She was not fighting anybody. Her face was completely calm. She looked like a woman checking whether the oven was preheated. Lincoln didn't say anything. He didn't shout. He put one hand flat against the brick wall of Pine Haven Middle School, and he stood there. And Officer Dominic Saylor later testified that the man's face went the color of the wet concrete, and that he did not move for 11 or 12 seconds, and that when he finally spoke, all he said was, "That's 2:41 in the morning." "Yes, sir. I'm at the bakery at 2:41 in the morning." "Yes, sir. We know. Every night." And Saylor, who was 29 and had a kid of his own, said, "Yes, sir. So did they." Corriveau Children's Hospital is 40 minutes from Wexbridge, in the city, and Lincoln Ostrander made it in 26 behind an ambulance he was not supposed to be following. Hank woke up in the elevator on the way to the 4th floor and asked, in a slurred, underwater voice, whether he was in trouble. The doctor who took him was named Ilana Bergeron, a pediatric hospitalist about Lincoln's age with reading glasses shoved into her hair and a completely unhurried way of moving that made everyone around her slow down. She listened to the paramedic report. She looked at the boy's arms, and then his other arm, and then, without any change in her expression, she asked the nurse to please page toxicology, and then asked Lincoln to step into the hallway with her. "Mr. Ostrander, has your son been prescribed clonidine?" "I don't know what that is. It's a blood pressure medication. We use it in kids sometimes, for other things." "Has he been prescribed anything at all that you know of?" "He's got there's a binder. There's a plan of care. There's a nursing agency." "I'd like to see the binder. Has anyone given him medication that you did not personally hand him?" Lincoln said, 16 hours a day for the last 4 months. Dr. Bergeron wrote something on the back of her hand, which he found strangely reassuring, and said, "Okay, we're going to do this properly." The tox screen came back at 8:15 that night. Clonidine, diphenhydramine, both present. Both well above what you would expect from anything on the child's medication list, because there was nothing on the child's medication list. Hank Ostrander had been prescribed exactly one thing in his life, an inhaler when he was 7, and it had expired in a drawer. Dr. Bergeron sat down on the rolling stool in the hallway outside room 412 and put it plainly. A dose of clonidine in a child this size drops the heart rate and drops the blood pressure. If he stands up too fast the next morning, he faints. Add diphenhydramine, and he sleeps 14 hours, and he's clumsy, and his hands feel wrong. Every symptom in that binder of yours is on this tox screen, Mr. Ostrander. Every single one. There is no disease here. Lincoln said, "How long?" "Based on the injection sites and the healing, and I want to be careful, but months, many months." Would it kill him? And Dr. Bergeron did not soften it, which he was grateful for the rest of his life. "It could," she said. "It has." Detective Zora Callahan of the Tilghman County Detective Bureau came to the hospital at 10 that night with a laptop and a woman from the district attorney's office, and they watched the card. 9 nights. The camera ran on a loop, overwriting itself, so 9 nights was all that survived, and 9 nights was more than enough. 4 of them were nothing. A boy sleeping, a room, the sound of a furnace. 2 of them had a woman in navy scrubs coming in, checking a pulse oximeter, sitting in the folding chair, and reading a paperback under a clip-on lamp, exactly the way it looked in the brochure. And 3 of them had the other thing. The last one was the worst, because there was audio. There was a rustle, and a hallway light, and a woman's voice very low saying, "He's out, he's fine, hold it." And another woman's voice, Aubrey's voice, the voice that had complained about uneven dinner rolls in October 12 years ago, saying, "Wait, let me get the picture first. It has to be before." Detective Callahan paused it there and said, "Mr. Ostrander, do you know what she means by the picture?" He didn't. Not yet. Aubrey arrived at Corriveau at 11:40 that night, and she was magnificent. Lincoln stood at the end of the corridor and watched his wife of 11 years do the best work of her life. She cried in exactly the right register. She asked the charge nurse 3 specific, competent questions. She said the phrase, "I have been begging people to take this seriously for 8 months," to a resident who had no idea what was happening and who nodded. And then, at the door of room 412, she stopped, just for a second, and she looked past her unconscious son at the corner of the room where the bookshelf was, and Lincoln watched her eyes go to the shelf, and then to the ceiling corner, and then to the window frame. She was looking for cameras. That is the moment Lincoln Ostrander stopped being a husband and became something else. Not louder, quieter. He said hello to her. He let her hug him. He said the doctors were doing tests. He did not say the word clonidine. He did not say the word card. He stood in a hospital hallway with his wife's arms around him and made himself into a man who knew nothing, and it was the hardest physical thing he had ever done, harder than the summer his father died and he ran the shop alone for 11 weeks. Because Rhea Underhill had told him something on the phone at 9 o'clock that night, in the parking garage, and it had rearranged him. "Listen to me," she'd said. "They will get out in front of this. Tomorrow morning, that agency's attorney is going to file something, and the story is going to be that a desperate, sleep-deprived father, who already put a hidden camera in his son's bedroom, coached an 11-year-old into taping a camera to his own chest, and that the injection sites are from a legitimate care plan signed by a physician. Are you hearing me? They have a signature. You have a memory card. I have a video of a woman with a needle. You have a video of a licensed nurse administering something during an authorized night shift in a home where she is legally present. Do you understand? Everything you saw is a crime, and every single frame of it also has an innocent explanation ready to go, because they built it that way. It is not enough. Then what is enough?" And Rhea Underhill, from her office above the dry cleaner, said, "Money. It's always money. A doctor's signature protects a nurse. It does not protect a spreadsheet." Amaris Gillespie had a state car with 190,000 miles on it and a caseload of 41 open matters, and she was, by her own description, the least glamorous law enforcement officer in the Commonwealth. She was an investigator with the Medicaid Fraud Control Unit out of the Attorney General's office. She spent her life reading billing records. She came to the bakery because Lincoln couldn't leave during a bake, and she sat on a stack of flour sacks with a coffee and let him talk while he shaped 400 loaves, and at the end of it she said, "You know what the most useful thing you just told me was?" "Not the video." "What then?" "The picture." She flipped her notebook around. "Your wife said, 'Let me get the picture first. It has to be before.' Mr. Ostrander, do you know what electronic visit verification is?" He did not. So she explained, and it was the first time in 6 months that anything had made him feel like a man standing on solid ground. Every state in the country is federally required to verify that home care visits actually happen. No more paper timesheets. When a nurse starts a shift in a patient's home, she clocks in on an app on her phone, and the app captures the time, and the GPS location, and the service code, and it all goes to a state aggregator. It exists for exactly one reason, because home care agencies used to bill for visits that never occurred. Little Lantern, Gillespie said, does something extra. It's in their own policy manual. It's on their website. They're proud of it. Every shift, the nurse takes what they call a care photo at clock-in. The child in bed, safe, Positioned. Ashcombe sells it to families as accountability. Look, we're here. Here's your kid, sleeping safely. Lincoln stopped with a dough scraper in his hand. Every shift, time-stamped, geotagged, stored on their server for 7 years because their liability carrier requires it. She let that sit. He built a surveillance system, pointed it at the crime, and told everybody it was a customer service feature. And your wife was the one taking the photo in your son's room, which tells me something else, which is that she was helping the nurse hold the schedule, because the photo has to be time-stamped before the med, or the kid looks sedated in it. He put the scraper down. How many kids does that company have? 141 active, Gillespie said. And that, Mr. Ostrander, is what I do for a living. I don't care about one nurse and one needle. I want to know how many of the other 140 are real. Tova Hallinan was 23, had worked at Little Lantern for 19 months as a scheduling coordinator, and had a whiteboard above her desk with a grid on it that she had drawn herself because the software wouldn't show her what she wanted to see. Her job was to fill shifts, which meant she was the only person in the building who saw the whole schedule at once. And what she had noticed, and had brought up twice to her supervisor and once to the clinical director, was this. Across 141 children, there had been 96 documented critical events in 18 months. Fine, sick kids have events. But 41 of them, nearly half, had been witnessed by 3 nurses. The same 3, Berenice Drage, Whitley Pruitt, and a woman named Sandra who had left the company. 3 people out of a nursing staff of 88. She had raised it as a quality question. She thought it might mean those 3 were better at recognizing events. She'd literally written that in an email. Maybe we should have them train the others. The clinical director, a nurse practitioner named Hester Ludlow, had told her not to run reports that weren't part of her role. 19 days later, Tova Hallinan opened the county paper and saw a photograph of Damien Ashcombe leaving a police station and a headline with the words "Pediatric Home Care and Investigation" in it. And she sat in her car in the parking lot of the Little Lantern building for 40 minutes, and then she went back inside, and instead of going to her desk, she went to the back conference room, and she logged into the scheduling system on the shared terminal, and she exported 19 months of assignment data to a thumb drive. Then, because she was 23 and scared and not stupid, she took photographs of her computer screen with her phone as she did it, so nobody could later say she'd altered anything. Then she drove to the Attorney General's regional office in Harrisburg and threw up in a planter outside the front door before she went in. The purge order came down 11 days later. All EVV media older than 90 days to be archived and removed from active storage, effective immediately, per a memo from the chief executive citing storage costs. By then the state had a preservation letter on file, and Amaris Gillespie had a copy of every care photo Little Lantern had taken in 2 years, and Tova Hallinan had a folder of screenshots that would eventually be Government Exhibit 14. And in the 4th week, the Cathcart file surfaced. Aldo Cathcart had been 9 years old. He lived in Delph, 1 county over, with his mother Verena, and he had been a Little Lantern patient for 14 months with a complex care designation and 16 hours a day of skilled nursing. On a Thursday in September of the previous year, Aldo had died in his sleep. Cardiac arrhythmia, said the death certificate, signed off by the county coroner's office after a records review with no autopsy, because the child had a documented cardiac history. The documented cardiac history consisted of 11 witnessed events. 9 of them were witnessed by Berenice Drage. Verena Cathcart had never questioned it. Why would she? They had told her for a year that this could happen, that they were staying awake so it wouldn't, and when it happened anyway, they had sent flowers, and Damien Ashcombe himself had spoken at the funeral about a Little Lantern going out. She had a framed photograph of him with his arm around her at the graveside. She was 31 years old, and she worked at a garden center, and she had not slept properly in 14 months. And when Amaris Gillespie sat down at her kitchen table and started asking about medication administration records, Verena Cathcart said, "Ma'am, I don't understand any of this. Are you telling me my son's medicine was wrong?" And Gillespie, who had done this 11 times in her career and hated it every time, said, "I'm telling you I don't think your son was sick." Lincoln met Verena Cathcart in January in the waiting area of a federal building, and neither of them could say anything for about 5 minutes. And then she asked him how old his son was, and he said 11. And she said, "Good. 11 is good. 11 is old enough to tape a camera to himself." Then she said the thing that Lincoln carried into everything that came after. Mine wasn't. Mine just went to sleep and believed them. The spreadsheet tab called Lantern had 141 rows and 9 columns, and Lincoln Ostrander read it once, all the way through, in a conference room in Harrisburg, and then went out to the stairwell and sat on the 3rd step down for a while. The columns were patient, plan hours, authorized through, family compliance, event yield, last event, assigned team, protocol, notes. Family compliance was a number from 1 to 5. Aubrey Ostrander's household was a 5. Event yield was a number 2, and Lincoln did not need anybody to explain it to him. Protocol was a letter. Most rows were blank. 11 rows had a letter in them. Hank said C. And the notes column, on Hank's row, in a cell you had to click to see the whole thing, said, "Father overnight employment M.SA. Out of home 2350-0800. Extremely regular. Ideal. Extremely regular. Ideal." Lincoln sat on that stairwell step and thought about his father, saying there are 2 kinds of businesses in this world. The kind where you can be late and the kind where you can't. He thought about 13 years of parking in the same spot at 12:04. He thought about how proud he had been of that. How he had told his son, more than once, that showing up the same way every single day was the whole secret, that it was the only thing he really had to teach anybody. They had read his life like a bus timetable. When he came back into the room, Amaris Gillespie asked if he was all right, and he said, "They planned all of it around me being predictable." "Yes, then let's be predictable," Lincoln said. "Here is the thing that made the trap work, and it is the thing that Damien Ashcombe never once considered, because men like Ashcombe never really believe the small parts of the machine are looking at them. The shift gets billed whether or not the child is in the bed. That was the rot at the center of it. If the fraud had required the child, it would have been fragile. But it didn't. Once you build a business on documenting events that never happened, you have trained your people to write fiction on a schedule, and fiction does not require a subject. So in February, 3 things were arranged, and none of them looked like anything from the outside. The first, Hank Ostrander was admitted to Corriveau Children's Hospital for a 5-day inpatient workup under Dr. Ilana Bergeron. Continuous telemetry. Continuous pulse oximetry. Every heartbeat recorded to a server, time-stamped to the second, in a building 11 miles from Wexbridge. It was real medicine, it was medically indicated, and it was also the most airtight alibi a child has ever had. The second, nobody told Little Lantern to stop the shifts. Nobody canceled anything. The house on Aldergate Road sat empty and dark, and the schedule on the refrigerator was not taken down. The third, and this is the one Lincoln did himself, he went to work. Every night, 11:40. Out the door at 11:55, parked at 12:04. 4 breakers, in order. Ovens, mixers, lights, cooler. The bakery windows went gold at 10 after midnight, so that anyone driving past on Delacroix Street would see exactly what they had seen for 13 years. Except that at 12:25, Salvador Ferrante, who had worked the ovens beside Rudy Ostrander for 11 years before he worked them beside Rudy's son, would come in through the back and take over the bake, and Lincoln would go out the front, walk 2 blocks in the cold, and get into the passenger seat of a state car with 190,000 miles on it. "You know," Gillespie said the first night, handing him a coffee, "in 14 years I've never had a witness whose cover was that he actually had to go make bread." 400 loaves, Lincoln said. "Sal's better at the seated than I am. Don't tell him." On the 4th night, February 11th, at 2:31 a.m., a white Little Lantern van with a small brass lantern on the door turned onto Aldergate Road. Berenice Drage was 53 years old and had been a licensed practical nurse for 29 years. She parked in the driveway. She let herself in with the key from the lockbox. She did not turn on the overhead lights, because you don't, because there's supposed to be a child asleep. At 2:34 a.m., she clocked in on the Little Lantern app. Her phone recorded the time and the GPS coordinates and transmitted them to a state aggregator that neither she nor her employer could edit. At 2:35 a.m., she took the care photo. She stood in the doorway of Hank Ostrander's bedroom and photographed a bed containing a rolled comforter and 2 pillows arranged lengthwise under a blanket, and she uploaded it with the caption, "The app suggests," the one they all use, PT resting comfortably. Then she went downstairs, sat at the kitchen table, and began her flow sheet. At 3:12 a.m., she documented a witnessed apneic episode lasting 18 seconds, with associated bradycardia, to 51, resolved with stimulation and repositioning, family notified. At 6:40 a.m., she documented a second, shorter event. At 7:52 a.m., she clocked out, having provided, per her own signed record, 8 hours and 18 minutes of continuous skilled nursing care to a child who was, at every one of those minutes, asleep on the 4th floor of Corriveau Children's Hospital, with 3 leads on his chest, and a nurse named Dane checking on him hourly, generating a telemetry strip that showed a boy's heart doing an ordinary, boring, beautiful 82 beats a minute all night long. And at 11:04 p.m. the evening before, Aubrey Ostrander had sent a message inside the Little Lantern staff app, a system with a 19-month retention policy that she had never once thought about. To Berenice Drage, "He's at Corriveau till Friday for tests. Don't cancel anything. If we drop below the hours, we lose the authorization, and then we start the whole reauth over. Just run the shifts." 11 minutes later, Drage had replied, "Okay, same as Delph?" And Aubrey had written back, "Yes." Amaris Gillespie read that exchange at 4 in the morning in a car outside a dark house and put her forehead on the steering wheel for a second and said, very quietly, "Same as Delph." Because Delph is where Aldo Cathcart had lived. The Little Lantern Gala was held the last Saturday in February at the Marchbanks Hotel ballroom in the county seat, and it was, by a distance, the social event of Tilghman County's winter. 400 seats, silent auction, a slideshow of children's faces with a piano under it. Ticket money went to the Little Lantern Family Fund, which provided respite grants to families of medically complex children, and which was, incidentally, entirely legitimate. Ashcombe had never taken a dollar out of it. He didn't need to. The fund was what let him stand in front of 400 people once a year and be looked at. The catering for the gala had been done for 4 years running by a firm out of the city. The desserts, for the last 2 years, had been done by Ostrander Bread Company because Aubrey had suggested it, back when Aubrey suggesting things was still the best part of Lincoln's week. Nobody canceled that order either. 340 lantern-shaped shortbread cookies, iced in warm amber, boxed in flats, delivered to the Marchbanks service entrance at 4 p.m. on Saturday, February 28th, by a man in a flour-dusted quarter-zip who signed the delivery sheet, took his empty flats back to his truck, and then did not leave. He stood at the back of the ballroom by the coffee service with his hands in his pockets, and nobody looked at him twice, because he was the bread guy. Damien Ashcombe spoke at 8:40. He was very good. He talked about a mother he'd met in an emergency room who had been told for years that it was nothing. He talked about the 96 nights his nurses had sat awake that month. He said the 3 words at the end and let them land, and 400 people applauded, and at the head table Aubrey Kirkwood, she had filed to restore her maiden name in January, put her hand flat on her chest. Dessert service started at 9. Every table got a flat of amber lanterns on a white cloth. The head table got theirs last, carried in by a server who had been a Pennsylvania State Police corporal for 6 years. Under the lantern cookie on Damien Ashcombe's plate was a 4x6 photograph, face up. It was a still frame from a memory card, grainy, lit by hallway light, shot from a boy's chest looking up. A woman in navy scrubs, a syringe, a doorway, a phone screen glowing white. Timestamp in the corner, 2:41:07 a.m. Ashcombe looked at it for about 2 seconds. He did not pick it up. To his enormous credit as a performer, his face did nothing at all. And then he looked up and across the ballroom, scanning, the way a man does when he knows the room has changed. And he found, at the back by the coffee service, the bread guy, who was looking directly at him. Lincoln Ostrander did not smile. He did not nod. He held up his left hand and tapped his wristwatch twice. Then the doors opened. There were 14 of them. Medicaid Fraud Control Unit, FBI, State Police, and 2 detectives from Tilghman County. They did it quietly, which somehow made it worse. Nobody yelled. Amaris Gillespie walked the length of that ballroom in a coat with rain on the shoulders and said Damien Ashcombe's name and read him his rights, while a slideshow of children's faces was still cycling on the screen behind him. Berenice Drage was taken in the coat check line. Aubrey was taken in the lobby, and she said one thing, loudly, that 400 people heard, which was, "Lincoln, tell them I was trying to help him." Sutton Kirkwood was arrested at 9:20 p.m. in the parking garage, sitting in a little lantern van with the engine running and a soft-sided cooler on the passenger seat containing 11 vials of clonidine hydrochloride, 9 vials of diphenhydramine, and a stack of pre-printed flow sheets for the following week, already partly filled out, with events already written in for nights that had not happened yet. That was the detail that ended any possible defense. They had written down the seizures in advance. The exhumation of Aldo Cathcart was authorized on March 9th. Liver tissue and hair analysis came back in 7 weeks. Chronic clonidine exposure, escalating over the final 4 months of his life, with a terminal concentration consistent with an acute dose. He had never had a cardiac condition. He had never had anything. Verena Cathcart was in the hallway when they told her, and she did not cry. She said, "So he was healthy," in a voice like a person confirming an address, and then she said, "He was healthy the whole time," and then her knees went. Damian Ashcombe was convicted at trial in the fall on 31 federal counts of healthcare fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy, and separately in state court of second-degree murder in the death of Aldo Cathcart, aggravated assault of a child in 8 cases, and endangering the welfare of children. The federal judge gave him 320 months. The state gave him life. He is at a facility outside Frackville, and he has filed 4 appeals and lost all 4. Berenice Drage pleaded guilty and got 28 years. She never explained why she did it. Investigators eventually concluded that the answer was smaller than anyone wanted. She made $109,000 a year at Little Lantern, which was more than double what she had ever made anywhere else. And Damian Ashcombe told her she was the best clinician he had. Hester Ludlow, the clinical director, cooperated on day 1 and testified for 9 hours. She got 4 years and surrendered her license. Dr. Cyril Nussbaum, who signed every plan of care without ever once examining a child for longer than 9 minutes, and who received what his own accountant charitably called consulting income of $218,000 over 3 years, got 151 months, and the medical board took his license before sentencing. Sutton Kirkwood got 8 years. Marjorie Kirkwood, who had made 41 calls to the managed care plan, impersonating a case coordinator to push authorizations through, got 2 years and 11 months, and told the judge it was a paperwork misunderstanding. Aubrey pleaded guilty in the spring to child endangerment, conspiracy, and 11 counts of healthcare fraud. She tried to cooperate. She was 7 months late to that idea and had nothing left to sell that Tova Hallinan hadn't already handed over for free. She got 14 years. Her parental rights were terminated 8 months later in a hearing that lasted 19 minutes, and Lincoln Ostrander sat through it with his hands folded and said nothing at all except, "Yes, Your Honor," twice. Tova Hallinan finished her nursing degree with the help of a scholarship fund set up by, of all people, Verena Cathcart. She is a pediatric nurse now, at Corriveau. 11 children came off protocols they never needed. 9 of them recovered completely, and the Commonwealth changed a rule. It is a boring rule. It is 2 paragraphs long, and no one outside the industry has ever heard of it. And it says that in pediatric private duty nursing, a documented critical event that triggers or maintains a service authorization must be corroborated by an independent data source, device telemetry, a call record, an emergency response, anything at all that is not simply a nurse's handwriting. 14 other states have since adopted a version of it. In Pennsylvania, the regulation is indexed under a case name, the way regulations are, and the case name is Ostrander. Hank Ostrander is 14 now. He got the color back in his face somewhere around the 2nd month. His resting heart rate is 81. He grew 4 inches in a year and a half, and he is deeply annoyed that he is still shorter than his father. He draws again. Cutaways, mostly. Houses sliced open with all the rooms showing. He comes in on Saturdays at 5 in the morning, and he is not good at the seeded loaves either, and Sal Ferrante gives him grief about it in 2 languages. Roxy, who is 8, sits on the flour sacks and narrates. The sign over the window on Delacroix Street was repainted the summer after the trial. It used to say, Ostrander Bread Co., EST, 1978. Hank asked if he could design the new one, and he spent 3 weeks on it, And what he came up with was the same sign with one line added underneath, in small letters, that most customers never notice and the ones who do never ask about. It says, "We're open at night." So here's what I keep coming back to, and it's not the villain. Villains are easy. The thing that will not leave me alone about this story is the phrase in that spreadsheet, extremely regular, ideal. Lincoln Ostrander's greatest virtue, the one thing he was proudest of, the thing he thought he was teaching his son, was the exact thing they used to build the plan. He showed up the same way every night for 13 years, and somebody looked at that and saw a window. And I think a lot of us would fail that test, because most of the decent people I know are decent in a pattern. Same route, same hours, same trust in the same institutions. But look at how it ended. That same predictability is what made the trap work. He kept the lights coming on at 10 after midnight. He gave them exactly the man they'd planned around, and then he stopped being in the building. You don't have to become somebody else to win. Sometimes you just have to know which part of you they're reading, and then hand it to them empty. The other thing, and I mean this, please hear it, is the boy. An 11-year-old told his father something in a truck in the rain, and his father half believed him, and then when the grown-up solution failed, that kid solved it himself with $40 and a roll of elastic tape and a Sharpie. He wrote, "If I am asleep, open this" on the back of it, which is, I think, the bravest sentence in this entire story, because it means he understood he might not be awake to explain. Kids tell you. They tell you in weird, flat, sideways little sentences about door hinges and cold arms, and they only tell you a couple of times before they stop. Whatever else you take out of this one, take that. I'm Nathan. Take care of the people who are asleep in your house.